Survival horror. Just hearing the name conjures up images of dark hallways, scarce ammo, and the overwhelming feeling that something's gonna jump out at you, and probably kill you. But what does survival horror actually mean? Is it just about running out of bullets and hiding in a closet? Or is there something deeper, something that sets these games apart from other types of horror experiences? Survival horror isn't just about scaring you, it's about forcing you to think under pressure. You're not just surviving monsters, you're surviving the odds. Every bullet matters, every corner hides danger, and every decision could be the one that gets you killed. It's about living on the edge of panic, where running feels smarter than fighting, and saving your game feels like an accomplishment.
Anyway, I'm sure you have everything under control.
Wait a minute, that's the bunny.
Talk to you soon.
Is he still there? He is still there! Whoa, what is that?
I've spent way too many hours creeping through dimly lit corridors and conserving ammo like it's gold to pass up the idea of making this video, because survival horror is honestly one of my favorite types of horror in gaming. Today we're going to be taking a closer look at what makes this amazing genre or subgenre of horror. So grab your flashlight and maybe some spare batteries, because this is going to get dark. What the hell am I saying, honestly? There's a good reason why Resident Evil is often the first name that comes to mind when thinking about survival horror. It wasn't just the game that gave the genre its name, but the one that defined how it played. Since 1996, Resident Evil has introduced players to a survival experience unlike anything they've seen before. And it all started in a mansion that felt more like a trap than a refuge. The core of Resident Evil was built on tension. You weren't some overpowered action hero, you were a vulnerable character navigating a labyrinth of narrow hallways, locked doors, and deadly enemies. Resources were limited: ammo, healing items, and even ink ribbons for saving your game. Every decision carried weight. Do you use your last shotgun shell on that zombie, or do you try to dodge it and risk taking damage? And then there was the fear itself. From the iconic first zombie encounter to the sound of footsteps echoing in an empty hallway. Resident Evil was a masterclass in atmosphere. The fixed camera angles weren't just a technical limitation, they were part of the horror. You couldn't see what was waiting around the corner in most of the fixed camera angles, and that uncertainty made every step feel like a gamble. But survival horror wasn't just about the combat, it was about, well, survival. The game constantly reminded you that you were in over your head. Puzzles slow you down, forcing you to think while the threat of danger loomed. Inventory management made every item a decision. Do you carry more ammo, or do you take that key that you might need later? The Spencer Mansion felt alive, like it was working against you. And that was the point. You were never supposed to feel safe, even in the safe rooms scattered around the entire game. This was the blueprint for survival horror. Tension, vulnerability, and the constant question of how far you would go to survive. And while the genre has evolved over the years, because let's face it, this blueprint isn't gonna match the final design. Resident Evil had laid the foundation, but as survival horror grew, so did its challenges. How do you innovate without losing what made the genre special? And how can fear still feel fresh after all these years? Let's take a look. Now that we've talked about classic survival horror, let's talk about modern survival horror and what makes it so great. And before I even continue, I gotta say there are some things in here that I'm pretty sure you don't really know, so I would stick until the end if I were you. First, resource management is one of the genre's oldest hallmarks. A survival horror game thrives when it makes you think about how you use what little you have. Ammo, health, tools, power, they're all finite. The goal isn't to hoard, it's to constantly assess risk versus reward. Do you use your last grenade to take out a group of enemies? Or do you save it for a boss fight you might not survive without it? Do you close the door to prevent Bonnie from coming in preemptively, or do you risk letting the animatronics get closer? Because all of this makes what survival horror is all about. It's all about resource management, or at least mostly. These decisions keep you engaged and force you to plan ahead, even as the game ramps up in pressure. The next thing is environmental design. Now this is kind of underappreciated in survival horror games, because they're not just the same as your typical horror game, which I discussed in my previous video, as I said, I think, at least before. The environments in survival horror games aren't just backdrops, they are part of the gameplay. Spaces are deliberately designed to feel claustrophobic, disorienting, or alive in some way. The Spencer Mansion, as we've talked about before, in Resident Evil 1 feels like a maze of locked doors and hidden passageways, while the USG Ishimura in Dead Space makes you feel like you're trapped in a decaying tomb, haunted by echoes of its former inhabitants. A well-designed space isn't just about atmosphere, it's about how it forces the player to interact with it. Next is immersive storytelling. Survival horror also relies on storytelling that draws you in. It's not just about monsters, it's about understanding why those monsters exist. In games like Silent Hill 2 or Resident Evil, the horror isn't just external, it's tied to the protagonist's guilt and trauma, creating a story that lingers long after the credits roll. A good survival horror game makes you care about the world, the characters, and what's at stake, even if it's just about your own survival. Next, combat and conflict. Now, I know that combat seems like a no-brainer in any, survival horror or even action game, but combat survival horror is less about domination and more about desperation. Enemies are designed to feel overwhelming, whether it's through their numbers, their unpredictability, or their sheer power. You're not mowing them down, you're trying to stay one step ahead. Games like Resident Evil 4 Remake balance this by giving you powerful weapons but overwhelming you with enemies, forcing you to prioritize targets and constantly adapt. They also don't give you a lot of ammo for your most powerful guns. They limit it to a certain restricted amount. And lastly, pacing. Pacing is everything. A survival horror game knows when to back off. It's those moments of calm, the empty hallways, the save rooms, the rooms where nothing happens, that make the bursts of chaos so much more effective. And while the game constantly pushes you, it also respects your choices. Whether you want to rush ahead or move cautiously, a good survival horror game gives you just enough agency to feel like you're carrying out your own path, even when it's leading you straight into danger. At the end of the day, survival horror isn't just about scaring you, it's about creating a system where fear, strategy, and curiosity all coexist. A great survival horror game doesn't just test your reflexes, it tests your ability to think, to adapt, and to keep going when everything is working against you. And when it's done well, survival horror feels less like a genre and more like an experience.
Stay away from the door, Joe. I'm gonna kick this door down. Hurry! This way!
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
Survival horror has come a long way, at least from the original Resident Evil on the PlayStation 1. But where does it go from here? We're seeing a revival of classic franchises with games like Silent Hill 2 Remake and Alone in the Dark, trying to bring old school horror back into the modern era. But remakes can only take the genre so far. So the real question is, what's next? What about AI-driven horror and unpredictability? Yes, I know you guys are going to scream at me in the comments because I'm talking about AI-created horror games or something like that, but no, hear me out. One of the biggest shifts we're starting to see is the use of AI to make horror more unpredictable. In Alien Isolation, the Xenomorph wasn't just a scripted enemy, it learned from how you played, forcing you to stay on your toes. More games are starting to embrace this, like Amnesia the Bunker, where the monster reacts dynamically to your choices. The future of survival horror might not be about harder enemies, it might be about smarter ones. And it's not just about the AI of the enemy designs, or the side characters and stuff like that. What about randomly generated worlds? What about places, not just like doors or anything like that, or games like that that have just randomly generated worlds like dread holes or doors, as I said before. But what about a game that changes based on how you play, based on what you're scared of? What if it senses your fears and reacts to that? Something along the lines of this. Now, I know this is going to take a while to make, but if there are games that hone in on what you specifically are scared on and make AI or personal driven and tapered horror games, survival horror games, that could be the future of not just survival horror, but gaming as a whole, or even horror gaming. Next would be more immersive and interactive worlds. Now, survival horror has traditionally been about tight, claustrophobic spaces, but we're seeing a lot more games experiment with open-ended environments. Resident Evil Village gave players a lot more freedom to explore, and even Resident Evil 4 Remake with the lake section, while games like The Forest blend survival mechanics with emergent horror. The challenge moving forward is how to keep the tension intact when players have more control over how they engage with the game. Now, we see only limited amounts of places where you can interact with the environment in survival horror games, but what about puzzle solving, where you actually have to interact with every part of a room? Now, I know this is going to be difficult for the game engines and stuff like that we have now, but as I said, this is the future. Anything could happen. So what if the world is a lot more interactive? Something at least on the lines of Bethesda's Starfield or Fallout, where you can interact with literally every little thing. The next would be the line between horror and action. One of the biggest ongoing debates in survival horror is how much action is too much. Resident Evil 4 showed that horror can thrive along intense combat, but other games take the opposite approach. Resident Evil 6. The best survival horror games in the future will need to balance these extremes, finding ways in new ways, not just old ways, to make players feel vulnerable without making them feel powerless. Next is something more Silent Hill-ish, psychological horror and narrative depth. Now, I know that Silent Hill has its own thing, but what if more survival horror games took the idea of having psychological horror to mix in with their, like real horror, or not real horror, more like, traditional horror, like Resident Evil. Something like Alan Wake or Alan Wake 2 definitely accomplishes this pretty well. Survival horror isn't just about the monsters, it's about how the horror affects the mind. Games like Silent Hill 2 and Soma, and even Alan Wake 2, as I said before, prove that psychological horror can be just as terrifying as physical threats. You don't need monsters to go and, jump scare you, even though they are there for the gameplay. But if you have things that actually scare you, things or something that can scare you beyond the typical, enemies that horror games have been using for the past 20 years. As the genre evolves, we're likely to see more games that focus on this specific storytelling and player-driven horror, where your choices, your fears, and your past experiences shape how the game unfolds. And this also has a lot to do with the AI generated and the more immersive and interactive world parts that I discussed prior to this. But all in all, the best survival horror games don't just make you afraid, they make you think. They make you question how you play, how you react, and how far you're willing to go to survive. And if the future of the genre keeps pushing those ideas further, then we might just be entering a golden age of horror gaming. Furthermore, if we go and innovate more than we ever have in creating these survival horror games, we can make completely different experiences that will scare us without the, getting used to the original and things that Resident Evil 2 Remake or Resident Evil 4 throw at us. We have totally different experiences with totally different levels of horror, with totally different types of horror. This, all compounded together, could create probably some of the best horror games in the future. And I think we're going to be seeing these very soon, especially with how fast technology is advancing right now and in the future. Survival horror has been around for decades, as we have discussed earlier, and yet it's still evolving. It's one of the few genres that doesn't just challenge players, it forces them to adapt, to think, and to make choices they wouldn't have in any other type of game. And that's why it still matters. At its best, survival horror isn't just about fear, it's about tension, about control, and about making you feel every single decision you make. Whether it's through limited resources, unpredictable enemies, or environments that work against you, the genre thrives when it makes you engage with its systems, rather than just reacting to them. Some argue that horror games today aren't as scary as they used to be. Others say that the genre has evolved into something better. The truth, survival horror isn't just one thing. It's a constantly shifting formula. It's a balance between old and new, between action and terror, between giving the player control and taking it away at just the right moment. No matter how much it changes, one thing is certain, and only one thing. True survival horror will always find a way to get under your skin. And as long as developers keep pushing the genre forward, and as long as we, the consumers, keep vying for this, there will always be something lurking in the dark, waiting for us. Thank you, and remember, stay safe out there.